And what global markets were actually hit? Global markets were hit with fresh volatility this week after U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed plans to impose tariffs on imports from three of America's biggest trading partners. Donald Trump agreed to pause for 30 days 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada after both countries agreed to take steps to clamp down on opioid fentanyl crossing the borders into the United States. There was no pause for China, however, which faces 10% import tariffs and has subsequently retaliated with tariffs of up to 15% on American goods. Now, joining us for more on this is founder, Hirenia Capital, Petri Redelius. He joins us via Zoom from Johannesburg. Good to have you join us on Well Now. Now, you work in the stockbroking and asset management sector. So far, how would you say President Trump's tariffs announcement have impacted the markets?
Well, good afternoon, firstly, and thank you very much for chatting to me today. So far, I don't know. The initial reaction was one of shock. We saw the rand, as well as obviously the U.S. dollar index. So the dollar versus a basket of other currencies. So obviously we monitor the rand quite closely. We saw the initial reaction to that the rand weakened a huge amount. In other words, the dollar strengthened a whole bunch. We also saw the dollar strengthening versus the Mexican peso and the Canadian dollar in ways that it hadn't moved against those two currencies in particular for many, many years. So initially, I mean, it looks like the dollar is strengthening on the back of this, right? I think there's been a very interesting way that he is doing things, right? He's coming out very, very strong. He's coming and putting a very strong hand on the table and saying, look, we will put tariffs on everything to do with your country unless, you follow these guidelines or these rules or negotiate with me on the following things. After that, we see generally that he backs down a little bit. Essentially, what our perception is of Donald Trump's technique at this stage is that he's negotiating the hard way. So he comes in with very strong threats and he says, look, either you negotiate with us about how we're going to, fix this issue, whatever it may be between our two countries going forward, or, you will bear the consequences. And so far, almost every country then turns around and says, all right, okay, let's negotiate. At the end of the day, I think Trump is for the free economy and for the markets. He understands that just blindly slapping tariffs on every product that comes into his country is probably going to be very bad for his economy. However, he also does understand that force and fear is a negotiation tactic, which is what he is using. So he is basically coming out and saying, I am stronger than you are, and either you toe the line or you will suffer more than I will. And generally, it seems that tactic is working, right? From the previous videos that you've shown, the left, the Biden supporters that did lose the election, I will add, it seems to be very unhappy about this. But it's interesting to me because, firstly, the majority of people in America voted for Trump, otherwise he wouldn't be president. What we have is the minority of people or the losing side being really upset that Trump is doing exactly what he said he would do, which is interesting because it's the second time that he's president, or his second term.
Yes.
And so far from, my limited experience in politics, I've been involved with financial markets for about 15, maybe 18 years now. And from what I've seen is that Donald Trump truly is the only politician that actually does what he says he's going to do.
All right,
and he doesn't waste time or words in doing so either.
And that appears to be strengthening the dollar, in the midst of all that is happening. But of course, the world is reacting to it. Now, beyond the tariffs that the President Trump is imposing, he's also withdrawing the U.S. from the UN Human Rights Council, for instance. He's not resuming funding for UNRWA, and he plans to shut down the USAID. How might this affect Africa, which has benefited immensely from the world body largely funded by the U.S.?
I don't think that Trump is doing anything that's going to long-term harm the world economy, right? I think that we look at this and we go, as the beneficiaries, I mean, even South Africa are beneficiaries of USAID, right? And we think that, oh no, this is going to be immensely bad for our economy and for, the livelihoods of people in South Africa or, other parts of Africa. But if you look at the market's reaction, our top 40 index is trading almost at all-time highs. The US markets are trading at almost at all-time highs. Um, Having a trade agreement between our two countries where we get an opportunity to actually renegotiate the entire trade agreement might not necessarily be a bad thing. Like, for example, we've got a trade agreement with the US at the moment, which allows for the import of really cheap chicken, right? And that's bad for our local economy in many ways. Because we have chicken manufacturers and farmers that are really under a huge amount of pressure. So if we could, for example, renegotiate that portion of the trade agreement, we might have to make concessions on other portions of the trade agreement. But if we basically scrap our current trade agreement and go back to square one and restart from fresh, I think we can find a way where both countries can benefit mutually from one another instead of one benefiting more from the other. Also, I think it is probably a healthy position to be in to not necessarily accept as much aid from first world countries, because a lot of the time, these aid packages come with strings attached. Like, for example, if you look at, Trump is pulling out of the World Health Organization, funding for the World Health Organization. Now, this sounds crazy, right? But at the same time, the World Health Organization has recently signed treaties with almost every country on earth that when the next pandemic comes around, the World Health Organization can sort of take over the running of a country. Now, these are people that want to run your country when they declare that there's an emergency and you didn't vote for them. So it makes sense to me why you wouldn't want to be as a part of that, part of that agreement. Why would you want someone else that you don't know to come in and tell you what rules you have to follow? Rather, you voted for a government, rather let them handle it. So I think that the position that is taken is actually quite a healthy one.
All right, and you think it's a call to action for, African leaders as well. But at this juncture now, what step do you think the UN as a body can take to boost revenue and continue its missions across the world?
I don't really know, to be honest with you. It's an interesting transition, I think, that we are faced with. I think the days of the United Nations, if the US pulls out, I mean, they're half of the funding. If the US really does pull out and stays out, and I think that leads almost to a dissolving of the United Nations. I think what we see is the emergence of a new type of global trade agreement or Security Council, if you will. At the moment, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is expanding. So Saudi Arabia is forming part of it now. The queue is long and vast for people or countries who want to join the BRICS trade agreement, or BRICS trade bloc, if you will. And if you look at that, they actually command more economic power globally now than what the United Nations nations do. So if you look at it sort of Western society or the UN versus BRICS, BRICS currently commands more economic power, including some 90% of the world's oil production. So I think that if Donald Trump is a wise man, which I think he is, he pulls out of the United Nations, and that gives him leverage maybe to say, listen, trade partners of BRICS, let's make a deal where the United States can retain a position of power without losing out to a trade agreement with countries that perhaps have different ideals to what the US currently has.
All right, so based on your reactions, I am curious to ask you, it does appear you're a capitalist.
I'm very much a capitalist. I'm a stockbroker. What do you expect?
And I very much agree with Donald Trump, for most of his policies so far, right?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with everything that he does, right? But I think what he does is pro-business. And I think the things that he's doing is, for example, peeling back or rolling back government oversight and executive control over almost every industry. I think that's a good thing. Right. If you look at sort of what a more capitalist kind of way of thinking is that, government regulations or government should be less involved with our daily lives, and we should be more able to determine our own actions and set our own rules and make our own decisions.
Okay.
So I think that peeling back government power and giving power back essentially to the people, so to speak, I think that's a fantastic thing, and I'm very, very much supportive of that.
It's a good way to leave the conversation. Founder, Hiranya Capital, Petri Widalingas, thank you very much for your time on World Now.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.